In one of the Russian propaganda programs, President Vladimir Putin asked a little boy, "Where do Russia's borders end?" And then he answered his own question with these words, "Russia's borders do not end anywhere." And this is very symbolic. After all, what was said as a joke, in fact, is the quintessence of Russia's foreign policy. The Kremlin leaders seem to have forgotten what huge price humanity has paid for border wars.
Принцип непорушності державних кордонів має дотримуватися.
The principle of the inviolability of state borders must be observed impeccably. Otherwise, the world will be flooded with bloody rivers of local wars, when each community of people with weapons in their hands will defend their right to independent development until the proclamation of the independence of their own state. In modern times, Ukrainians for the first time proclaimed their own state in 1917. The Ukrainian parliament, the Central Rada, proclaimed Ukraine's independence and marked its borders by virtue of the principles outlined in the Third Universal. In fact, these borders were the boundaries of territorial lands in which the Ukrainian ethnic population was a distinct majority. At that time, the ethnic understanding of the state was the norm. During the proclamation of the Third Universal by the Central Rada, the Ukrainian ethnic territories were significantly larger than those that were included in this document. Even in the 19th century, Ukrainians occupied much larger territories than the modern borders of Ukraine. Today, Ukrainian ethnic territories are part of such countries as Belarus, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Russia. At the start of the 20th century, Ukrainian territories were primarily part of the Russian Empire. Unofficially, they were called Little Russia, but incidentally, in the state register were designated as the provinces of Southwest Russia. Even then, both the Russian government and Russian science considered ethnic Ukrainians to be Russian people, but with some regional differences. By these differences, they explained the borderline situation of the Ukrainian provinces and a mixture with other peoples. Moreover, in the Russian ideology of statehood, the very name Ukraine was interpreted as having originated from the terms in the outskirts or on the periphery. This does not take into consideration the fact that the outskirts cover 9 large provinces and that Ukrainians differ from ethnic Russians by language, culture, mentality, daily life, and all other differences of a distinct nation.
Де була Україна?
Where was Ukraine in 1917? It consisted of 9 provinces of the European part of the Russian Empire. It is those provinces where Ukrainians, according to the census of 1898, accounted for 50 or more % of the population. In short, the majority. There were 9 such provinces, 3 on the right bank, 3 on the left bank of the Dnieper River, and 3 in the southern regions of Ukraine, among them Tavrida and Crimea. So when the Ukrainian state was proclaimed in 1917, it demanded autonomy from the revolutionary government in St. Petersburg within the boundaries of 9 Ukrainian provinces, including Crimea. After all, the Crimean Peninsula was economically and administratively directly tied to the Tavrida province and was considered a part of it. But neither the Tsarist nor the revolutionary liberal nor the revolutionary Bolshevik governments wanted to grant Ukraine independence, let alone even autonomy. The Bolsheviks, although they proclaimed the right of nations to self-determination, in reality considered the Ukrainian territories to be an integral part of Russia. First, they tried to seize power in Ukraine in a lawful way. They convened the All-Ukrainian Congress of Soviets. They planned to displace the Central Rada by a majority vote and elect a new government, only that of the Bolsheviks. But at the Congress, the Bolsheviks garnered the support of such a low number of delegates that they were offended and left the meeting. That was when they moved to Kharkiv, where they gathered a fictitious one-party congress and proclaimed themselves the only legal Ukrainian government. And already this fake puppet government, using hybrid technology, invited an army of invaders from Russia to our land. By the way, when in 1992 the Ukrainian Orthodox Church separated from the Russian Orthodox Church, the pro-Moscow hierarchs left Kiev for Kharkiv, gathered their one-party council there, and proclaimed the creation of a separate Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. The Kremlin's hybrid strategy is applied very often, and for some reason it is always in Kharkiv. Perhaps it is some kind of tradition for Moscow. In the end, the Ukrainian Revolution was a failure, and our lands were included in the makeup of the Soviet Union. Formally, it became the separate Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, though in fact it was a province that was fully dependent on Moscow. The Ukrainian SSR had neither its own army nor a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, not even demarcated borders.
На початку існування
Even at the beginning of the advent of Soviet power, the boundaries between the newly formed republics were largely dynamic. They were often moved to the west, then to the east, depending on the geopolitical situation and the interests of the central leadership in Moscow. As already mentioned, as leader of the Kremlin and the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin often played the Ukrainian card.
Як вже згадувалося в першому питанні, Сталін розігрував українську карту.
As an example, such was the case when it was necessary to put pressure on the Western allies of the USSR. At one time, Poland conducted Operation Vistula. It resettled Ukrainians from the regions of their traditional residence in the east of Poland to their western voivodeships on the border with Germany. So Stalin granted asylum on the territory of the Soviet Ukraine to those Ukrainians who agreed to resettle there. Thus, the leader of the Soviet Union seemed to have saved the Polish Ukrainians from genocide, but at the same time contributed to the loss of their ethnic territories, Holmshina and others. Although Soviet Russia itself from time to time annexed the territories of the conditionally independent Soviet Ukraine. In 1925, the Soviet government in Moscow adopted a decree on the distribution of borders between the Ukrainian, Russian and Belarusian Soviet republics. At the time, Ukraine had lost significant territories, which were inhabited by more than 478,000 people. In particular, this is about the Taganrog and Shakhty districts. In exchange from Russia, the so-called Putyvl-Tong in the Sumy Oblast and some other minor territories were transferred to Ukraine. 2 times less, the population lived there, around 278,000 people.
Я не кажу вже про Стародубщину в Росії.
Much less the Starodub district in Russia, the Krasnodar region, and the Kuban that I already mentioned, which were seized by armed force. And the Starodub, Kursk, and Ural regions, where are they? The Voronezh region, the vast lands of the Don region. Will you go there today? I used to go there. When I was on a specific mission, we brought Ukrainian textbooks and films, as there were no Ukrainian schools in these regions at all. The Ukrainian diaspora in Russia is the largest in the world. According to rough estimates, at least 2 million Ukrainians live in the Russian Federation, and almost 1 million of them, before the Russian-Ukrainian War, spoke Ukrainian in everyday life. A significant part of Russian Ukrainians live on territories that border with Ukraine. Formerly, these territories, before the beginning of the armed conflict in the east of Ukraine, were allegedly common Russian-Ukrainian. People crossed the border to take care of ordinary everyday affairs, to buy food or to visit friends.
Україна є цивілізованою державою, і її проблема.
For a long time, Ukraine has been a civilized state, and its problem lies in the fact that in 1991, the state border was not properly demarcated and delimited in due time. And if we say that this indeed was not done, then this begs the question: if the border was not demarcated and not delimited, then how can it be violated? So these borders were not legally delineated on the map.
Ці кордони чомусь не були нанесені відповідним чином на мапу.
The Kursk, Oryol, and Voronezh regions of the Russian Federation have traditionally belonged to the Zaporizhian Cossacks. They spoke Ukrainian, sang Ukrainian songs, and cherished the Cossack military tradition. And on the territory of the neighboring Starodub district, there was the Hetman capital of the Ukrainian Cossack state for a certain period of time in history. And during the times of the Russian Empire, these lands were considered predominantly Little Russian, that is, Ukrainian. However, a few years ago, Russian propaganda declared these lands, together with the eastern regions of Ukraine, the territory of Novorossiya. They say that Luhansk, Kherson, and some other southern and eastern regions of Ukraine were a wild field and basically a no-man's land. They supposedly were colonized by the Russians who founded Novorossiya there, although in fact these lands belonged to Zaporizhian Cossacks since the 16th century.
Всі розмови, які
All these talks about Novorossiya, the Donbass, or Luhansk regions started after the Russian occupation forces entered these territories. All these interpretations and concepts were never seriously discussed in Ukraine until the war in the Donbass broke out and when Crimea was occupied. What does all this mean? All these territories about some mythical features of the Donbass, that Kiev is not Donetsk and about Little Russia, were all invented exclusively in the upper echelon of Kremlin offices.
Про те, що Київ – це не Донецьк, про Малоросію, придумані в кремлівських кабінетах.
Formally, the province of Novorossiya did exist in the Russian Empire. In truth, it was founded for the first time on the territory seized from the Tatar Crimean Khanate in the times of Russian Empress Catherine II. It existed for less than 9 years. Upon the death of the Empress, the province of Novorossiya was disbanded, and its lands were distributed among the neighboring provinces. Later, Emperor Pavel I tried to restore Novorossiya, but even during his reign, it only lasted for a short time of around 6 years. After this, the artificial formation of Novorossiya ceased to exist, and the colonization of these lands did not transpire the way that Russian propaganda today depicts it in the mass media. As for the ethnic makeup, there was such a pattern. The most intensive Ukrainian colonization covered the territories from Bessarabia to the Kuban, including the Kuban itself. In the Stavropol region, it was already 50-50, half Russian, half Ukrainians, or even less than half. And closer to the Volga, somewhere near Astrakhan, the colonization was already almost entirely Russian. The lands of Novorossiya were inhabited by ordinary Ukrainian, Russian, and Tatar settlers. There was much of an alien element. The Russian government gave the lands of Novorossiya for settlement of the refugees from the oppression of the Ottoman Empire, among who were South Slavic peoples, Serbs, Bulgarians, and those from Montenegro. There were also separate German colonies. It is clear that out of this hodgepodge of various ethnic groups, no separate people could arise, as the Russian propaganda presents.
Окремий новоросійський етнос ніколи не існував.
A separate Novorossian ethnos never existed. In the conditions of pioneering the development of new imperial lands, they were settled here either voluntarily or forcibly, like serfs. They were from different parts of the Russian Empire, but also from other countries. In particular, these were German colonists. That means that territorial and administrative unit called Novorossiya, which existed at the turn of the 18th to 19th centuries, has nothing to do with the Kremlin's modern-day propaganda project under the identical name Novorossiya. Its purpose is completely different – expansion to the lands of the south and east of Ukraine. The Russian authorities needed a land passage to the already occupied Crimea and to their enclave that they called the Republic of Transnistria. I think that they would already be in Dubasari and Bender. This is how they wanted to seize Kherson, Mykolaiv and Odessa, and then to jump out to Transnistria. It is no coincidence that the police chief who provoked the confrontation in Odessa when there was an attempt to detain him fled to Transnistria, and in my opinion he is still hiding there. All the more, his own brother was the head of the militia in the so-called self-proclaimed Transnistrian Republic. The idea was to finally cut off the access of Ukraine to the sea. Russian saboteurs were actively preparing to execute a coup d'etat in the Odessa Oblast to cut it off from Ukraine and to establish on those territories the terrorist entity Bessarabian Republic. Even the chairman of this quasi-state was already appointed. Similar processes were planned to be organized and held in the neighboring Kherson and Mykolaiv Oblasts. However, this terrorist activity was successfully stopped by the Security Service of Ukraine. At one time, the forces of the Security Service of Ukraine conducted a special operation aimed at preventing the so-called Bessarabian Republic on the territory of the southern part of the Odessa Oblast. Thanks to this operation, groups of separatists were found and localized, in particular from among the Russian-speaking ethnic Bulgarian population.
Етнічного за болгарським походженням населення регіону.